Picture this. A girl's cry reverberates through the stone halls of Bowett Castle on a cold winter night in 1457 AD. The sound slices through the roaring wind like a knife through silk. In a chamber lit only by wavering candles, 13-year-old Lady Margaret Beaufort clutches the blood-stained sheets beneath her, her frail body racked with torment no child should ever suffer. The midwives murmur Latin prayers, their faces grim in the shifting shadows. Outside, snow drifts onto the frozen earth of Bedfordshire, but inside this chamber, a future King of England is being forced from a girl scarcely past childhood. Margaret's auburn hair sticks to her sweat-soaked face as another wave of agony crashes upon her. They believe she will not survive. The infant is too large, her hips too slight. At only 13, her body is still unfinished, still growing. Yet here she struggles to deliver the boy who will one day rule England as Henry VII. The irony is clear to all present. This infant, born of such torment, would end the bloodiest struggle in English history and establish the Tudor dynasty that would transform the world. Before delving into these forgotten tales of endurance and despair, if you enjoy uncovering hidden truths of the past, consider pressing the like button and subscribing for more stories like this. And please share in the comments where you are listening from. I find it astonishing that we explore these ancient accounts together from distant corners of the world, bound across time by our shared hunger for history. The girl writhing in that bed was no ordinary noble child. Lady Margaret Beaufort carried in her veins the blood of royalty, specifically that of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the fourth son of Edward III. But royal blood, as Margaret would learn across her remarkable life, could be both gift and curse. In the brutal political world of 15th century England, ere the Wars of the Roses would soon split the kingdom apart, such lineage marked you as either a prized pawn or a perilous rival. Margaret's path to that birthing chamber began years earlier when she was still a little girl wandering the gardens of Bowett Castle. Born around May 1443 AD to John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bowett, she entered a realm where loyalties shifted like sand and marriage was the sharpest weapon of politics. Her father died when she was scarcely more than an infant. Some claimed by his own hand after military defeats in France left him broken and disgraced. Others whispered of poison, for in those days rumours of poison clung to every sudden noble death like crows trailing an army. The manner of John Beaufort's death haunted Margaret's childhood. He had commanded English forces in France during the last stages of the 100 Years' War. Powerless as territory won by Henry V slipped away piece by piece. The disasters gnawed at him like a disease. When he returned to England in 1444 AD, courtiers remarked on his hollow gaze and trembling hands. He spoke rarely, ate little, and spent hours lost in silence. On May 27, 1444 AD, he was discovered lifeless in his chambers at Wimborne Minster. The official reason was fever, but those closest to him knew otherwise. Whether by blade, poison, or the crushing weight of defeat, John Beaufort had chosen death over dishonour. Margaret's mother wasted no moment in securing her daughter's survival. The Dowager Duchess Margaret Beauchamp understood the harsh rules of a world where women and children mattered only for the alliances they sealed. By the age of 6, young Margaret was promised to John de la Pole, son of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. The agreement bound two of England's strongest houses in a bond that appeared unbreakable. But politics shifted faster than childhood. And when Suffolk fell from power and was murdered while crossing the English Channel in 1450 AD, that betrothal became meaningless parchment. Suffolk's crime had been arranging the marriage of Henry VI to Margaret of Anjou and the surrender of Maine and Anjou to France, terms that infuriated the English nobility, too, and common folk as well. His death was savage even by the harsh standards of that age. Dragged off his ship by pirates or political foes, he was forced to kneel on the gunwale while one of his captors hacked off his head with a dull sword, needing half a dozen clumsy strikes to finish the act. The Beaufort women learned early that survival demanded flexibility. Her next binding came swiftly, to Edmund Tuda, Earl of Richmond, half-brother to King Henry VI through his mother's marriage to Owen Tudor. The Tudors were Welsh newcomers with uncertain legitimacy, but they possessed one thing more valuable than ancient lineage: the king's favour. Owen Tudor had once been a court attendant who caught the attention of Catherine of Valois, Henry V's widow. Their secret union had scandalised the nobility, yet it produced two sons, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, whom Henry VI acknowledged and raised to the peerage. In 1455 AD, when Margaret was about 12 years old, she was wed to Edmund Tuda in a ceremony that forged political alliances with words of affection she scarcely understood and vows that would bind her to a destiny beyond imagination. The wedding was held at Bowett Castle, the very fortress where Margaret had spent her childhood. The great hall was adorned with tapestries showing the deeds of her Beaufort forebears, while the chapel where vows were spoken held the tomb of her grandfather, John Beaufort, Earl of Somerset. Edmund Tuda was a man in his 20s, hardened by war and politics. Margaret was still slipping out of her childhood dresses. The marriage was consummated at once. There was no concept of waiting for physical maturity in a time when noble girls were treated as vessels for dynastic breeding. The wedding night was a trauma Margaret never spoke of in later years, but the evidence of its toll would be etched into her body's lasting damage and her lifelong religious devotion that edged into obsession. Within months of the marriage, Margaret's body began to change in ways that terrified her young mind. The elder women around her whispered about her condition, their expressions blending joy for a possible heir with concern for one so young. Her own mother watched her daughter's swelling belly with grave worry. She had been 18 when Margaret was born, old enough to endure childbirth safely. But at 12, nearly 13, Margaret faced a danger that had claimed countless women older and stronger. Yet Edmund Tuda would never see his child born. In the autumn of 1456 AD, while campaigning in Wales against Yorkist forces, he was captured at Carmarthen Castle. The details of his capture and death remain clouded, hidden in the haze of civil war and intrigue. Some reports claim he was seized in a sudden raid while his men were scattered across South Wales. Others suggest betrayal from within his own ranks. Whether he perished from plague in prison or was slain by his captors remains one of history's unresolved riddles. The plague explanation was convenient for his jailers. Disease was rampant in medieval dungeons, and blaming illness avoided accusations of murdering a royal half-brother. But contemporary chroniclers remarked on the suspicious quickness of his decline and the refusal of captors to allow physicians to treat him. What is certain is that by November 1456 AD, Margaret, only 13 years old, was widowed, pregnant, and utterly alone in a world about to be torn by civil war. The news of Edmund's death reached her at Lany Palace in Pembrokeshire, where she had been living while her husband campaigned. The messenger arrived on a rain-soaked November evening, his horse lathered with sweat from the desperate ride across Wales. Margaret was in the palace chapel, praying for her husband's safe return. When the echo of the rider's boots filled the stone floor behind her, she knew before he spoke that her world had shattered. Jasper Tuda, Edmund's younger brother, assumed responsibility for his pregnant sister-in-law. The choice was both gallant and practical. Margaret carried the possible heir to the Tudor line, the child who might continue their family's royal bond. He brought her to his fortress at Pembroke Castle in Wales, where the massive stone walls provided shelter from the growing turmoil beyond. Pembroke stood like a sentinel on the edge of the world, perched upon cliffs above Milford Haven, where the Atlantic waves ceaselessly pounded the rocks below. It was within this isolated Welsh stronghold that Margaret would face the most harrowing trial of her young life. The journey to Pembroke during her advanced pregnancy was an ordeal in itself. Winter roads were barely usable, churned with frozen mud and obstructed by fallen timber. Margaret travelled in a horse-drawn litter, every jolt and lurch sending pain through her swollen frame. A trek that should have taken 2 days dragged into 5 as they detoured around flooded rivers and skirted roaming bands of armed men whose loyalties were uncertain. Pembroke Castle in winter was a stern refuge built upon a limestone crag above the Pembroke River. The fortress commanded the landscape for miles around. Its great circular keep, nearly 80 feet tall, had withstood sieges and tempests for 3 centuries, but comfort was never its purpose. Survival was. The castle's chambers were cold and draughty, warmed only by immense hearths that devoured wood faster than the servants could deliver it. Margaret's rooms were lined with heavy tapestries to block the gales that whistled through the cracks in the ancient stone. The winter of 1456-1457 AD was especially merciless. Ice gaths erred inside the windows, and the sea wind shrieked through every gap in the masonry. Margaret, her belly heavy with child, could scarcely cross her chamber without exhaustion, her body, still in many respects that of a child, strained beneath the burden it carried. The castle's physician, a learned man who had studied at Oxford and Paris, observed her with rising concern. Her hips were too narrow, he confided to Jasper Tuda. The infant was poorly positioned. Delivery would be perilous, perhaps deadly. Dr. Lewis Carlion was a man who had brought children into the world for both queens and peasants alike. He had read the works of Hippocrates and Galen, attended lectures by the finest scholars of his age, and amassed 40 years of experience in medicine. Yet as he examined the young expectant mother before him, all his wisdom felt powerless. Margaret's pelvis had not yet matured. She herself was still growing. The baby was large, lodged incorrectly, and already showed troubling signs. In private, he voiced his fears to Jasper Tuda in the castle's solar. Snow whirled beyond the narrow windows as the 2 men whispered over Margaret's fate. Carlion was blunt. He had encountered this situation before, and it seldom ended well for mother or child. They might attempt to turn the infant, but that could instantly kill both. They might wait, hoping nature would shift the position, but every day increased the risk of the child's death and Margaret's collapse. Or they could attempt a caesarean birth, a procedure almost always fatal to the mother. Jasper Tuda, himself scarcely 25, now bore the crushing responsibility of deciding his sister-in-law's fate. If Margaret died, the Tudor line would perish with him, a younger son lacking legitimate heirs. If she lived but lost the child, the outcome was the same. The political stakes were immense, but so too was his personal sue. He had grown attached to the brave, perceptive girl who had met widowhood with such grace. Through the bleak winter months, as her pregnancy advanced, Margaret revealed a maturity far beyond her years. She spent her hours absorbing knowledge of politics and governance, sensing instinctively that wisdom would be her greatest weapon in the battles to come. Jasper Tuda, impressed by her resolve and intellect, became her mentor in the arts of survival. He instructed her to read expressions, to catch the unspoken meanings hidden in diplomatic language, to grasp the tangled web of alliances and rivalries that shaped noble society. Margaret also devoted herself to religious study with an intensity that troubled her attendants. She spent long hours in the castle chapel, kneeling before the altar until her knees were raw and bleeding. She memorized Latin prayers, absorbed theological texts, and forged a deep personal bond with God, one that would carry her through decades of political turmoil. Some historians argue that her fervent devotion began as a way of coping with the trauma of child marriage and impending motherhood, a method of giving purpose to suffering that otherwise felt meaningless. The castle's priest, Father Meredith, became another guiding figure in Margaret's education. A Welshman educated at Cambridge before taking holy orders, he understood both the scholarly traditions of the universities and the harsh practicalities of survival in a violent age. He taught Margaret that God often acted through human hands, that prayer without effort was hollow, but effort guided by prayer could reshape destiny. On a January night in 1457 AD, Margaret's labour began with pains so fierce they bent her double. She had been walking the battlements, following Dr. Carleon's insistence that exercise was essential for her health. When the first contraction struck, the agony was unlike anything she had ever known, a crushing, tearing force that seemed to split her in two. She collapsed against the stone walls, gasping as her attendants rushed to lead her back to her chamber. The midwives, women hardened by experience who had brought countless children into the world, exchanged grave looks. They had witnessed this before. A child attempting to deliver another child, nature pushed past its limits by human ambition and political need. They readied their tools and whispered their prayers, fully aware that before dawn one, or perhaps both, lives might be lost. Dame Gwenvch Dafford, the head midwife, had delivered infants for 3 decades. She had learned her art from her mother and grandmother, inheriting ancient knowledge passed down through Welsh women for generations. She knew herbs that eased pain, methods for repositioning breached infants, and prayers that seemed to lend mothers strength. Yet as she examined Margaret, her weathered face grew solemn. The other midwives laid out their instruments with grim precision. There were knives for cutting the cord, but also for procedures too dreadful to name, hooks and forceps for extracting stillborns, potions to bolster frail mothers, and sacred relics to summon divine mercy. The chamber thickened with the smoke of burning herbs, lavender to soothe, rosemary to fortify, and other plants whose secrets were known only to those who served at life's entrance and its exit. For 18 hours, Margaret endured agony beyond description. Her screams rang against the stone walls until her voice broke, leaving only guttural animal sounds of suffering. The midwives worked relentlessly, their hands slippery with blood as they fought to save both mother and child. Dame Gwen drew upon every technique she possessed: massage, shifting positions, herbal draughts, and ceaseless words of encouragement murmured into Margaret's ear. Jasper Tuda stalked the corridor outside, his boots striking the flagstones. Come on. Owing that the very future of the Lancastrian cause might perish within that room, he heard Margaret's cries through the heavy oak door, each one cutting into him like steel. Servants scurried past with basins of hot water and armfuls of clean linen, their faces etched with the weight of the crisis. In the chapel, Father Meredith prayed without pause, pleading for the young girl whose life now hung by a fragile thread. As dawn broke, Margaret's strength ebbed. She had laboured nearly a full day, her frail body driven beyond endurance. Dr. Carleon, roused from uneasy sleep, examined her swiftly and whispered in urgent tones to Dame Gwen, the 5. The baby still lived, but in distress, its heartbeat faint and uneven. Margaret was bleeding inside, her pulse weak, her skin pale as parchment. The choice was made to attempt manual extraction, a perilous procedure that could save the child but might cost the mother's life. Dame Gwen had performed it before, but never upon someone so young and frail. She positioned Margaret carefully, whispering prayers to St. Margaret of Antioch, patron saint of childbirth. When at last the infant was pulled from Margaret's body in a process that nearly claimed her life, the midwives held their breath. The child was pale, scarcely breathing, slick with blood and birth fluids. For one dreadful instant the chamber was silent, save for Margaret's ragged breaths and the crackle of fire in the hearth. Then Dame Gwen cleared the infant's mouth and throat, and the sound that changed everything filled the air. A thin, furious wail announcing the arrival of Henry Tudor, future King of England. Margaret, half conscious, her young body shattered by the ordeal, heard her son's first cry through a fog of pain and exhaustion. She tried to stretch out her arms, but her body refused to obey. Dame Gwen placed the newborn briefly on his mother's chest, the sacred first meeting of mother and child, before rushing him toward the fire to be cleaned and swaddled. Margaret's eyes clung to him, burning every detail of his tiny features into memory. The damage to Margaret's body was grave and lasting. Dr. Carlion, examining her in the days that followed, found terrible tearing and internal wounds that would never heal fully. He whispered of torn flesh, damaged organs, and blood loss that had almost proved fatal. She would never bear another child. This one catastrophic birth had ended her childbearing before it had even truly begun. At just 13 years old, she was rendered barren, her fertility sacrificed to the ruthless demands of dynastic ambition. Her physical recovery was long and agonizing. For weeks, Margaret hovered on the edge of death, racked by fever and infection. Dr. Carlion tried every remedy in his knowledge: bloodletting to balance humours, herbal poultices to fight infection, and fortified wines laced with medicines to restore her strength. Dame Gwen never left her side, spooning broth between her cracked lips and watching over her with tireless vigilance. Her emotional recovery was even more complicated. Trauma haunted her dreams, leaving her waking in screams and tears during the night. She developed an intense dread of human touch, recoiling even from the gentle hands of her attendants. Her bond with her newborn son was tangled by the connection between his presence and her agony. She adored him fiercely, yet often found it unbearable to hold him without being consumed by memories of his violent birth. But though Margaret Beaufort's body was broken, her spirit endured unbroken. In the slow months of recovery after Henry's birth, she revealed the iron resolve and sharp intelligence that would one day make her among the most formidable women in English history. Even in weakness, she knew her son embodied the future of the Lancastrian cause. She also recognized that a young widow with an infant needed protection in a realm sliding into bloodshed. The Wars of the Roses were erupting with mounting ferocity. In 1455 AD, the First Battle of St. Albans had declared that England would settle its dynastic quarrels not through diplomacy, but through sword and axe. The White Rose of York now stood against the Red Rose of Lancaster in a war that would consume England's nobility for the next 3 decades. Richard, Duke of York, claimed the crown through his descent from Edward III's second son, while the Lancastrians held it through their line from Edward III's fourth son, John of Gaunt. Margaret, bearer of Lancastrian blood through her Beaufort ancestry, now found herself automatically tied to a cause rapidly losing ground. The Lancastrian king, Henry VI, was widely considered weak, perhaps insane, and certainly unfit for effective rule. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, was far more capable but even more despised, viewed as a foreign woman blamed for England's defeats in France and the kingdom's slide into civil war. Her answer was marriage once more. In 1458 AD, scarcely recovered from Henry's birth, she wed Sir Henry Stafford, the younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. The ceremony was a subdued event, nothing like the grandeur that had marked her union with Edmund Tuda. Margaret was still frail, still grieving, and her new husband was a stranger chosen for political expedience rather than affection. Stafford leaned toward Yorkist sympathies, but more importantly, he was pragmatic, realizing that protecting Margaret also meant safeguarding the valuable Beaufort estates and bloodline. For Margaret, this marriage symbolized security for herself and her son, even if it required sharing a bed with a man whose loyalties conflicted with her own deepest convictions. It was less a romantic partnership than a business arrangement, a practical solution to pressing dangers. The marriage contract, negotiated between Margaret's mother and Stafford's father, was highly detailed, reflecting the volatile political climate. Margaret would maintain authority over her Beaufort estates, securing her son's inheritance. Stafford, in turn, promised military defence and political shelter for the family's Lancastrian leanings. Most crucially, young Henry Tudor would remain in Wales under the guardianship of Jasper Tudor, a provision that likely preserved his life. The marriage to Stafford endured 14 years, spanning some of England's bloodiest struggles. Margaret stood on the sidelines as the war's fortunes surged back and forth across the realm. Kings rose and fell with dizzying speed. Henry VI deposed, Edward IV crowned, Henry VI restored, and Edward IV triumphant again. Each shift in power brought new peril for families with suspect loyalties or coveted bloodlines. Margaret grew increasingly adept at steering through these treacherous tides. She fostered bonds with women from both factions, recognizing that female networks often outlasted male alliances. She corresponded openly with Elizabeth Woodville, Queen to Edward IV, while secretly maintaining communication with Margaret of Anjou in exile in France. Such ties demanded exceptional caution. A single careless word could amount to treason. During these turbulent years, Margaret's son Henry remained in Wales under Jasper Tuda's protection. The arrangement was necessary but heartbreaking. She saw her only child at most once or twice a year, and then only under carefully arranged conditions. Henry matured from infant to boy to youth apart from his mother, raised in the Welsh hills by his uncle while she manoeuvred the labyrinth of English court politics. The separation weighed heavily on her. Margaret poured her maternal longing into letters, coded messages designed to cross enemy lines without exposing dangerous secrets. She sent gifts when possible, books, clothing, small keepsakes to remind Henry of the mother he barely knew. Yet she lived in unending worry, never certain whether her son was safe, healthy, or even still alive. Henry's upbringing in Wales was both thorough and practical. Jasper Tuda ensured his nephew learned more than the customary noble arts: riding, swordsmanship, music, and dance. He was also taught the harsher skills of survival. Henry mastered Welsh fluently, absorbed the patterns of rural life, and learned how to command the loyalty of men who owed him nothing but loyalty. These teachings would prove priceless when he eventually returned to seize his throne. Margaret's own learning continued during her marriage to Stafford. She mastered the management of vast estates, studied financial accounts, and grasped the intricate web of obligations that held medieval society together. She pursued law, history, and theology with the focus of a university scholar. Her library became one of the most impressive private collections in England, containing works in Latin, French, and English on subjects from military tactics to mystical theology. In 1461 AD, everything shifted again. Edward IV secured a decisive triumph at the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest clash ever fought on English soil. Around 50,000 men gathered on a snow-covered field in Yorkshire on Palm Sunday, March 29, 1461 AD. By nightfall, nearly half lay dead. The Lancastrian cause collapsed, its leaders scattered or slain. Henry VI fled to Scotland while Margaret of Anjou sailed for France with her young son, Edward of Westminster. The aftermath of Towton created new dangers for Margaret. Her Lancastrian heritage made her instantly suspicious in Edward IV's eyes, yet her marriage to Stafford offered some protection. More perilous still, her young son in Wales represented a possible rallying point for Lancastrian defiance. Edward IV had already shown his readiness to execute foes. Would he extend that cruelty to children? Margaret endured sleepless nights fearing soldiers would come for Henry. That one morning she would wake to the news of his death. To protect him, she built an elaborate intelligence system, paying servants and merchants for tidings from Wales, bribing clerks for copies of royal letters, doing everything she could to stay a step ahead of danger. The constant vigilance was draining, but it preserved her son's life. In 1469 AD, Henry Stafford was wounded while fighting for Edward IV at the Battle of Edgecote. A deep gash in his thigh became infected, leaving him partly crippled and increasingly resentful of his service to the Yorkist king. He had risked his life for Edward IV and received little recognition or reward. The frustration embittered him, making him open to Margaret's quiet influence. She nursed her husband through months of agonizing recovery, using the time to gently guide his political sympathies. She never openly promoted the Lancastrian cause. That would have been too dangerous. Instead, she sowed doubts about Edward IV's competence, whispered accounts of Yorkist corruption, and slowly persuaded Stafford that his loyalty had been poorly repaid. It was a delicate psychological game. She had to undo years of Yorkist allegiance, gratitude for Edward's past mercy, and Stafford's cautious nature. She succeeded through patience, subtlety, and careful appeal to his wounded pride. By 1470 AD, when the Earl of Warwick rose in rebellion against Edward IV, Stafford was ready to defect. That same year, the political stage shifted once more. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the mighty noble called the Kingmaker, broke with Edward IV and allied with Margaret of Anjou to restore Henry VI to the throne. The alliance was astonishing. Warwick had first placed Edward on the throne and fought against Henry VI for years. But politics breeds strange companions, and Warwick's pride outweighed his former loyalties. Margaret followed these events with fierce interest and growing hope. If Henry VI could be restored, if the Lancastrian banner could prevail, then her son might return from exile in Wales. She began cautiously reaching out to fellow Lancastrian supporters, testing the waters for an uprising. Each letter, each meeting carried immense risk. Exposure meant death for all involved. The restoration of Henry VI in October 1470 AD felt like a miracle to Margaret. Edward IV fled to Burgundy, his brother Richard of Gloucester accompanying him, while Henry VI was brought out of the Tower of London and ceremonially restored to the throne. The poor, deranged king appeared bewildered by the reversal of his fortunes, unsure how he had gone from prisoner to monarch overnight. Margaret attended the restoration ceremony at Westminster, witnessing firsthand how frail and confused the Lancastrian king had become. But the restoration was short-lived. Edward IV returned from exile in March 1471 AD, backed by Burgundian aid and a small force of hardened mercenaries. He acted swiftly, winning support from nobles who had grown weary of the turmoil and instability. The decisive clash occurred at Barnet on April 14, 1471 AD, where Warwick was slain in battle. 2 weeks later, at Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471 AD, the Lancastrian cause was extinguished forever. In 1471 AD, everything shifted. The Battle of Tewkesbury brought the final downfall of the Lancastrian cause and the death of Edward, Prince of Wales, the last direct heir to Henry VI's crown. The prince perished in the fighting, though some accounts claim he was executed after capture. His death, followed by the mysterious disappearance of Henry VI soon after, ended the direct Lancastrian lineage. Suddenly, Margaret's teenage son became the strongest surviving claimant to the Lancastrian succession, and thus one of the most dangerous figures in England. His claim was distant and complex, running through the Beaufort line and clouded by legitimacy questions raised generations earlier. Yet in the absence of any direct Lancastrian heirs, Henry Tuda's claim grew increasingly compelling to those opposing Yorkist rule. Jasper Tudor, recognizing the immediate peril to Henry's life, made a desperate choice. He would carry the boy into exile rather than risk his capture and almost certain execution. The decision was agonizing, but unavoidable. Remaining in Wales meant death. Exile meant abandoning all Henry had ever known. On a storm-lashed night in September 1471 AD, 14-year-old Henry Tudor boarded a ship at Tenby and sailed into 14 years of exile in Brittany. The departure was hasty and perilous. Yorkist troops were closing in on the last Lancastrian bastions in Wales. Henry and Jasper had scarcely an hour's warning before enemy soldiers reached Pembroke Castle. Margaret was not present for her son's departure. She remained in England, unaware her child was fleeing for his life until days afterward. When the news finally reached her, the blow was devastating. She had already endured 14 years separated from Henry by the breadth of Wales. Now they were parted by the English Channel and hostile nations. She could not know if she would ever see him again. Standing on the Welsh cliffs in her imagination, cloak whipped by the wind, Margaret confronted the possibility that she had lost everything she cherished. Her son was gone, perhaps for good. Her cause lay broken, its leaders slain or scattered. Her own position was increasingly fragile as Edward IV secured his victory and exacted retribution upon his foes. Margaret returned to England and to her marriage with Henry Stafford. Her heart hardened into something colder than steel. If she could not be a mother in the traditional sense, she would become something else entirely: a strategist, a survivor, a woman devoted to placing her exiled son upon the throne of England. The anguish of separation turned into calculated ambition. The transformation was striking. Courtiers who had once known Margaret as a reserved, devout young woman now faced a formidable political schemer, capable of thinking several moves ahead. She began assembling networks of allies across England, identifying nobles who might be persuaded to support her son's eventual claim. The effort was perilous and exhausting, but it gave her purpose. Henry Stafford died in 1471 AD, not long after Henry's exile began. The timing appeared suspicious to some. Observers suspected foul play. Stafford had suffered poor health since his war wound, but his passing came at a strangely convenient moment for Margaret's political manoeuvring. Whether natural causes, poison, or sheer strain ended his life remains uncertain, yet his death released Margaret to pursue her ambitions more openly. Now nearing 30 and twice widowed, Margaret faced a decisive choice regarding her third marriage. She might have chosen safety, marrying some lesser noble who would guard her estates and allow her to mourn her absent son. Instead, she chose power. Her third husband was Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, among the most politically skilled nobles in England. Stanley was a master of the very game that had ruined so many others. He excelled at siding with the victor at the final moment, shifting allegiances with such flawless timing that he alone eyes emerged on the winning side of conflict. His family commanded strong military forces in northwest England, and his political reach extended through every layer of society, from the royal court to the merchant guilds. For Margaret, alliance with Stanley meant entry into intelligence circles, political leverage, and military backing that might one day prove vital for her son's claim. For Stanley, marriage to Margaret brought him the prestige of Beaufort blood and links across the nobility. Their union was one of convenience, yet it proved highly effective. The wedding was lavish for its time, designed to declare Margaret's continued prominence despite her son's exile. The celebrations lasted 3 days, filled with tournaments, feasts, and religious observances that drew nobles from across England. Even Edward IV attended, perhaps judging it wiser to keep the dangerous Margaret Beaufort in sight rather than let her plot in the shadows. The marriage terms were carefully arranged. Margaret kept authority over her Beaufort estates and the right to champion her son's interests. Stanley gained a wife whose sharp mind and ties enhanced his own political craft. Both understood their partnership rested on mutual benefit rather than affection, a practical solution to their challenges. Together they endured the perilous last years of Edward IV's rule, surviving purges and upheavals that destroyed many others. Margaret used her role as Stanley's wife to gather intelligence on royal strategies and to maintain links with exiles and possible allies. Stanley provided her cover while reinforcing his own influence in preparation for future turmoil. Meanwhile, in Brittany, Henry Tuda entered manhood in exile. The Duchy of Brittany, formerly independent under Duke Francis II, was caught between the rival pulls of France and England. Henry's position there was fragile. He was valuable as a potential ally or bargaining piece, yet dangerous as a figurehead for English dissent against Edward IV. Letters between mother and son grew rarer and more carefully coded as years passed. They employed false names, invisible inks, and intricate ciphers, messages hid within seemingly harmless notes about trade or family. The method was awkward and unreliable, but it preserved the vital thread linking Margaret's network in England to Henry's life abroad. Margaret lived with unending dread that her son was already gone, killed by Yorkist assassins, or taken by illness or accident in a foreign land. The uncertainty was perhaps harder to bear than final loss would have been. She created an elaborate chain of informants bringing her reports from Brittany. Merchants, pilgrims, envoys, anyone who had glimpsed her son or heard word of his fate. The intelligence system she forged was vast and remarkably advanced. She placed informants in royal courts, merchant halls, monastic houses, and noble estates across England and the continent. Through this hidden web of communication, information poured steadily to her. That would have impressed even the most skilled spy masters. She learned of troop movements before some generals did, heard court gossip before it reached the king, and tracked the health and loyalties of both allies and enemies. Edward IV died suddenly in April 1483 AD, leaving his 12-year-old son, Edward V, as heir. The king's death was abrupt, though not entirely unexpected. He had lived recklessly, indulging in food and drink, and his health had been worsening for years. Still, his passing at only 40 threw the kingdom into turmoil, since a child king meant a regency that could easily turn into dictatorship. But the boy king was never crowned. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized power in a coup that shocked even England's battle-hardened nobility. Young Edward V and his brother Richard vanished inside the Tower of London, never to be seen alive again. Richard III was crowned king in July 1483 AD, but his rule began under a shadow of suspicion that never faded. For Margaret, Richard's usurpation brought both grave danger and new opportunity. Richard's grab for power had destroyed Yorkist legitimacy. Suddenly, Henry Tudor's distant claim through the Beaufort line appeared as a real alternative to a king believed to have murdered children. Margaret began plotting with bold determination, working through Bishop John Morton and other exiles. She organised rebellion in England while arranging for her son's invasion from Brittany. The conspiracy demanded flawless timing, heavy funding, and secure communication across hundreds of miles of hostile ground. The rebellion collapsed in October 1483 AD when treachery revealed Henry's plan. Margaret watched in horror as her allies were executed. She avoided death only because of her marriage to Stanley, but she was placed under house arrest and stripped of her titles. Yet Margaret was undeterred. Even confined, she continued plotting through coded letters and loyal servants. For months she prepared not only her son's return, but also his successful reign. When Henry finally landed at Milford Haven in August 1485 AD, Margaret's careful cultivation of the Stanley family bore its ultimate reward. At Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485 AD, Richard III was killed in the mud of Leicestershire. The Stanley forces, appearing ready to aid Richard, turned against him instead, a betrayal Margaret had long engineered through patient influence. Her son was crowned King of England. After 28 years of separation, 14 years in exile, and decades of plotting, Henry VII had triumphed. Margaret became the most powerful woman in England, yet she never again shared the simple closeness of mother and child that had been taken from her by politics. She lived to see her son found the Tudor dynasty, marry Elizabeth Otto, F. York to unite the rival houses, and father the prince who would become Henry VIII. She died in 1509 AD, only days after Henry VIII's coronation, having completed a journey of ambition that began in the blood-soaked chamber at Pembroke Castle. The price of Margaret's triumph cannot be measured easily. She gave her body to bring forth a king, her motherhood to political duty, and her happiness to dynastic ambition. The 13-year-old girl crying out in labour at Pembroke Castle could never have imagined the woman she would become, the king's mother, the founder of a dynasty, the figure who ended the Wars of the Roses by turning maternal devotion into political power. In Westminster Abbey, where Margaret Beaufort lies in her black marble tomb, visitors can read the Latin inscription that sums up a life of remarkable achievement born of immense sacrifice. But they cannot hear the echo of that distant scream, the sound of a child in agony, giving birth to England's future. That cry and the story it began remain hidden in the stone walls of a Welsh castle, where Atlantic waves still crash against the cliffs and the wind still howls through the ancient stones, carrying whispers of a girl who became a queen mother through suffering no child should ever endure.